a young man. He was 20. Through a series of circumstances, he ended up driving when he was so fatigued that it was equivalent to being under the influence. That was the medical opinion. And he drove into a guardrail on the M1 and killed his best mate, who was sitting in the front seat. It was just a heartbreaking sentence. He got sent to prison for 2.5 years. Literally, that could be anyone.
Welcome to Crime Scene Gold Coast with Guardian Criminal Law. It's lovely to have your company. We've been away for a little while, so it's nice to be back and shooting some content for you again. We've got Elizabeth Green from Bond University joining us today to discuss driving charges, particularly those involving an element where there is death and the sentencing for those sort of charges. I hope you get a lot out of this episode. Thank you. Welcome to Crime Scene Gold Coast with Guardian Criminal Law. Today we have the pleasure of having Elizabeth Green with us. Hi Liz, how are you?
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me.
And I just was reading a little bit about you. You've grown up here in Queensland.
Yes.
Grown up on the Gold Coast.
Yes.
And then travelled away to Rockhampton.
Yes, very different.
Yeah, Rockhampton when you were only a young teenager, is that right? Tell us a little bit about the Gold Coast and the move to Rockhampton.
Well, it couldn't have been more different, I don't think. So when I was down here, I did end up going to boarding school in Brisbane. And then my dad got a different job. He got principal of girls' grammar in Rocky. And I was meant to stay at boarding school, but I was too much of a sook. So I went up and went to school where he was the principal.
Okay.
So I went from quite the bustling beach town to the cattle capital of Queensland, Rockhampton. But actually it was the best move ever. I loved my years in Rockhampton. Yeah. Met my husband there. So.
Fantastic. And you've got 4 kids.
4 kids.
And then a law arts degree where you studied literature and law and worked with the DPP, so in prosecutions.
Yes.
What was that journey like?
It was amazing. When I was at uni, I always thought I'd end up doing family law.
Okay.
And I did just 1 week, work experience with a family court judge, and it was heartbreaking. You know, there's just nothing really, even when there's a good outcome, it's still because of something sad that has happened. And then I was lucky enough to get a job as a judge's associate. And obviously district court, most of the work is crime. So I was sitting there day in, day out, listening to trials and immersing myself in crime. And I realised that was something that I felt passionate about.
Okay.
And got to know a lot of the prosecutors, and then was able to make the move to the DPP when I finished my associateship.
What's it like when you first started the DPP? What sort of work do you do as a junior?
So pretty quickly I was up in court doing mentions and minor breach matters. So I'd say within 3 months I had that opportunity, and then I got a position as legal officer and was in Beenleigh, very bustling district court in Beenleigh. So it was a lot of sentencing, and unfortunately the nature of that, you know, demographic, there was a lot of property crime but also a lot of sex offences. So pretty quickly you get exposed to sort of the worst that people do to each other.
Yeah, Beenleigh Court is busy, but it's sort of surrounded by an area that's got some social and economic issues, doesn't it? It seems to be a harder place to grow up in and to live in.
Yes, yep. And a lot of, well, not a lot, but some return visitors to the court. So my judge was based in Beenleigh, who I'd been associate to, and he just had a lot of time for young offenders. He really felt that there were better ways to deal with young offenders. We had one of the cases that now is an authority for a non-custodial sentence for armed robbery for young offenders. Two boys, 17 and 20, who robbed a service station. And until that time, you know, it was usual to get actual imprisonment and substantial periods of imprisonment for an armed robbery. Fair because of the impact on the victims and that sort of thing. But he really looked beyond the crime, looked at the offenders, and they got an intensive correction order, which is a term of imprisonment served wholly in the community, and it went on appeal and the Court of Appeal upheld it. And so that case still is cited as a good authority for that. And for the time that I was at the DPP, they did not come back. So that order was the right one for them. So I feel like there's, there was a lot of good that came out of that kind of approach, which I've carried through, I think.
Yeah. Well, that sort of brings us to the topic of conversation that we were talking about earlier this week, and we're talking about dangerous driving causing, death and the penalties imposed and the public perceptions around that.
Mm.
And I thought that was, that is really something, because the newspapers sort of grab the sensational lines and the public then can be outraged, and with a little bit more information, perhaps they would not be so outraged or might come to an understanding of what's trying to be achieved. This is a sort of another extreme, Liz, but I was reading an article in the New South Wales Law Society publication that comes out, the Law Society Journal, LSJ, from New South Wales. And so that's our profession's, publication that comes out, a variety of topics, and I think it's the Proctor here in Queensland is the equivalent.
Yeah.
And there was an article about sexual offenders, and particularly people guilty of child sexual offences. And those sorts of crimes, they elicit a visceral response in most people that smacks of revenge, or, you will often hear down the pub, someone will say, if someone did that to my kid, I'd kill them,
Yeah.
And so it elicits that sort of response. But as you and I both know, it's generally not the response of the victims in the actual situation. It's a much deeper, sadder situation that you're looking at.
Mm.
And the stats bear out quite clearly that the best way to not prevent, but to try to assist in these perpetrators not committing crimes again is to hold them very close in the community, so that they're known to the community and that they're engaged with the community in a positive way through employment and housing, and all of those measures are the best way to stop it happening again. But there's something within us that resists it. There's something natural within us that just resists it, even though it seems to be the way to go.
Yeah. Look, as a mother, those crimes strike fear into your heart, and the sad truth is that they are far too prevalent. I'm currently updating the textbook and going through Court of Appeal judgments, and every third judgment is a sex offence,
Yeah.
So it is an actual problem that, there is so much of that type of offending. But again, it's this miscommunication or misunderstanding in terms of what's an appropriate punishment, how to deal with them. And the media jumps on things and says, a rapist walks free or something like that, which if you dig into it, that's not the case. They're not walking free, but no, they're not getting locked up for life, because that's not the answer. And so I think that lack of understanding, not just with sex offences, but with sentencing generally, is a real problem, because when there's a sense of injustice and that the community feels the court is failing people in the community or victims of crime, there's a lot of dissatisfaction. And in fact, as soon as you get some appreciation of everything that goes into the sentencing process, those sentences make so much sense. So
yeah, that's right. And when the result is a result that's questionable, we have a mechanism by which we can look at it again. It's not uncommon for us to appeal matters, and the DPP to appeal matters as well, to try to get it right.
That's
so
right.
There is a concerted effort by all the parties involved to get it right, for want of a better term.
Yes.
Yeah, when everyone's playing their part properly.
That's right. It's not a question of getting someone off. If someone's been convicted or they've pled guilty, well, that's a fact then. They're guilty of the crime, and then it's how best do we deal with this situation? What's going to benefit the community long term?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, look, I agree. And I think that getting it right, something that picked up a little bit later on in my career was that so if you've got the perpetrator of the crime, the person that's been charged with the offence, and they come and see you, and you can see that there may be a way to avoid being found guilty of the offence. And it might be a technical way of avoiding that. So we've just had this little thing. What's that going on? It might be a technical issue that enables you to avoid any sort of punishment. Or there may be a story that can be applied to it that will result in a verdict of not guilty. There's some doubt that can be raised. And that can often be the worst thing that you could do for the person that's been accused, because they don't have a pathway to correct what they're actually guilty of and then reintegrate themselves into the community in a proper way. And when they're deprived the ability to do that, that's not fair on that person that's been accused either.
No, because there's clearly something there that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and for their own well-being, quite often they need to confront that. And if they're denied that opportunity, it can manifest in something else that's quite negative in the person. It's like something that just hasn't been dealt with.
Yeah.
It's not like a sensational victory. You know, you do get the hardened ones that are quite happy when you can get them off on a technicality because they're not going inside. They treat it more as a game. But most of the clients that we have, they're not professional criminals. And so when they find themselves in this sort of trouble, there's a harsh sort of reality that comes to bear upon them.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very much prosecution through and through. I have not done any defence work, but even still you can see with some, when it comes to the sentencing stage, the types of submissions put forward on their behalf, and expressions of remorse and, you know, efforts that have been made pre-sentence to rehabilitate, you know, that all has to be of value and taken in the spirit that it's given. And not every offender is like that. And obviously we have recidivists, but there are so many who make a mistake, come to court, and they don't make that mistake again. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Many, many people that I have in their more mature years and have never ever had a problem in court. It'll be a one-off offence. And I've had a lot of success with offenders attending men's health help groups and making big improvements in their life as well. So, yeah, there are a lot of people that go quite well once given the opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Liz, we're going to talk about some dangerous driving sentencing in particular. Do you want to lead us off on that? I've got a couple of matters that we've done recently that are quite interesting, but I think the ones that you've marked here are really good.
Well, look, if you ever speak to any of my past students, when I get to the point in the course where I talk about this offence of dangerous driving causing death, I do get quite passionate about it.
Awesome.
And I think that stems from, and I can't remember if I told you this story already, but the very first dangerous driving case I did in Beenleigh was a young man. He was 20, and through a series of circumstances, he ended up driving when he was so fatigued that it was equivalent to being under the influence. That was the medical opinion. And he drove into a guardrail on the M1 and killed his best mate who was sitting in the front seat. And he was someone who'd never had any interaction with the courts before. He was, you know, a good kid who'd made a stupid decision, and it was just a heartbreaking sentence. He got sent to prison for 2.5 years, and in the courtroom on the day of sentence were his family, the victim's family. Everyone was crying. It was literally, that could be anyone who's done that. And so there are obviously examples of dangerous driving causing death, or GBH, grievous bodily harm, where the offenders are, you know, hell-bent on a deliberate course of conduct. They're evading police, or they're escaping from the scene of a crime, or whatever it might be. But for the most part, these types of offenders have done the wrong thing 100%. they're drink driving, they're speeding, they're on drugs, whatever it might be, but they're not hardened criminals. And they have taken a life, and that needs to be punished. And we have pretty harsh penalties for those types of offences. But it doesn't come across that way, I don't think, either in the media or in the collective perception of the community, because it's often, somewhere around 6 years for the penalty of 6 years imprisonment. Often there's earlier release because they've usually pleaded guilty, and there are prospects for rehabilitation. And so that doesn't seem, I think, in the collective of those who don't fully understand, a fair outcome.
Mm.
And so I feel like this is the kind of offence where an understanding of sentencing is just crucial to realise that justice is being served. And I think that divide is one that probably needs to be bridged.
Yeah. I think the legislation changed in 2018 in this area to reflect the community attitude and to reflect that custodial sentences must be imposed with these sorts of charges.
Yes.
So there has been a tightening up, and that's probably as a response to community inputs and community attitudes, I'd expect.
I'm sure it is. And I do think at the end of the day, someone's life has been lost or impacted irrevocably. And so I think imprisonment is a fair sentence. But do I think it's fair that they get life in prison or 15 years? Well, no, I don't. And that's from a prosecution's perspective.
Yeah.
So I think that, you can probably all recall reading about a dangerous driving causing death case, and they vary quite a lot in the sensational attitude of the media, depending on who the victims were or who the accused was. But at the end of the day, the common elements are that these are often not criminals.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
and they do vary so much. Yeah. I had one earlier this year that I discussed with you, and it was an older gentleman in his 80s, and he was quite an amazing man with an amazing background. He left school at age 12 to start working, and then worked in underground coal mines for 35 years and raised 2 boys, and was married to the same lady for his whole life, and she'd recently passed. And so he's living in an apartment by himself. He's got family helping him, and still mobile, still drives his car. And of a Sunday goes to drive to Brumbies to pick up fresh bread. Every Sunday he goes and buys a loaf of his favourite bread, and he has bacon and eggs once a week at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning, So, beautiful man. And through some circumstances all coming together, it was a clear day. There was not heavy traffic. He was returning from Brumbies. He was going under the speed limit. And another elderly man walked out onto the road. When you read the reports and you have a look at the scene itself, it brings you to the conclusion that it would have been difficult not to see him by both parties. And they were both going pretty slow. They should have been able to avoid one another, but it didn't work out like that. And so our client struck the other fellow who was he was in his late 70s, and he wasn't very mobile. He was walking with a frame or a stick. And he died there on the scene. And so there was absolutely no intent, and it was just he was charged with careless driving, occasioning death. And we had a discussion with the magistrate, and of course everybody was quite sympathetic. There was nobody intending on doing any harm here to anybody on the day, registered vehicle, sober man. And so nobody was after any sort of crushing penalty. He'd already handed his license in, so that's that, being proactive. Yeah. He was doing that. He wrote an extensive letter of apology to the family, and he was sentenced, I think it was 6 months wholly suspended, but it was a suspended sentence.
Yeah.
And I don't think that was inappropriate, but the public could very easily just see a headline saying, man killed by motorist only receives suspended sentence.
That's right.
And
That's right.
none of the rest is there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then on the other extreme, some years ago in northern New South Wales, I had a situation where it didn't cause death, but very nearly did. And it was a fellow he'd been through a very hard time personally, and he'd turned to drinking, and he was sleeping underneath buildings in towns up on the north coast, and the police would find him and move him on. And he got that drunk one day that he has no recollection. He takes off on the road and he sideswipes. I remember it was a Volvo station wagon, and in the Volvo station wagon was mum taking her 3 daughters to school. And it's like 7:30 in the morning. This guy's blind drunk, speeding, and sideswipes them on the road, and they leave the road down the shoulder and roll over an embankment into a paddock. And lucky that it was a very sturdy car, and none of them received any life-threatening injuries.
Amazing.
But, he has a lot more to answer for. He's gone on a rampage without consideration for his community. He's gotten himself drunk, so he's made those decisions, and then he's got behind the wheel of a car and turned it effectively into a weapon on the road.
Yes.
And lucky multiple people didn't die,
yes,
including himself.
Yeah, totally different level of culpability.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas the paper doesn't have time, the TV don't have time to explain these things.
No.
They just go straight for the sensational view.
And when there's sort of a push for awareness through the media for a particular type of offending, there isn't that ability or inclination maybe to draw those distinctions between offenders and cases, and there can be just statistics revealed that don't go into depth as to why there are such differences in penalty or why this was a low penalty, so you don't get the full story.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Liz, there's another area of this where this happens quite a bit, driving matters where there's serious injury or death. And it came to me after you and I were talking, because there's a direct crossover with youth sentencing. And that's in remote Aboriginal communities where the kids will pinch a car while they're young, and there'll be half a dozen kids pile into the vehicle. Nobody puts a seatbelt on. They're all just yelling and screaming and speeding off down bush tracks, and then they roll the car and a couple of kids die. It's not uncommon. It happens every year. Yeah. In Australia somewhere. It happens every year. And often it can be multiple deaths. I know in Fitzroy Crossing only a few years ago, I met this young Aboriginal man, and after I left Fitzroy Crossing a couple of years later, I learnt of this happening. And he and another mate stole a Land Cruiser. They went around and picked up all their mates, and there were 6 died in that. He was the driver. He was the only one who survived.
Which happens so often.
And then so that you've got all of that, 5 other children lost their lives. Those families are going to grieve forever. Mm. He's left alive. His family will now grieve forever because of what's happened. Mm. He's never going to be the same. His life will never, ever be the same. It's absolutely, absolutely tragic.
Yeah.
And I don't know what sort of sentences these young people are getting for these offences. I've got no idea.
Well, and in fact, my focus is on sort of adult offending in terms of my teaching and my area of interest, but there are different considerations under the Youth Justice Act, but I think still it's detention. Like, there's no question of that. So There was a case down here just in Sorrento where a boy stole or borrowed a car and crashed it in residential streets, and another boy died. And he, again, had no contact with police before that day, but his life is now completely different. He when I say boy, I think he was 18, so he did get sentenced as an adult. But he went to prison, and there's nothing you can do about that, you know? So, I mean, I think it is just that there is a serious consequence, but it's the length of that punishment and what happens beyond imprisonment that I think also should be a focus.
Yeah. And what's it? I suppose there's a lot of varied reasons for the offending when it occurs. It's not a common sort of. There's not much of a common thread, is there?
Well, no, and it seems to me a lot of younger offenders are drunk or on drugs, or they're youth who are engaging in unlawful use of vehicle offences, trawling neighbourhoods in the middle of the night. They get stupid, cocky, carried away, and the worst consequences happen. So in one respect, kids like that who are persistently committing property offending and drug offending, they are criminals, but it's a far cry from property offences to causing the death of someone, and a different level of culpability from someone who kills voluntarily. So it's a horrible leap that these kids or young people are making from minor offending to then being faced with a charge where your future is dictated by precedent,
Yeah, geez, it's tough. I was just thinking about a matter. I don't know why this matter came into my mind. I think it's because I was thinking about how information can be misinterpreted. I was thinking from the point of view of the public looking at information in the papers, and how that can be misinterpreted and misunderstood, and so it creates the wrong response, doesn't elicit the right response in our community. It doesn't elicit the healthy response. But it can work the other way around too. I remembered a matter, it make me laugh sometimes, but it was in a more remote community, and there was a fellow working, and he was working in some community program, and another fellow turned up on site and says, "The cops have run over your grandfather." And so my client thought that the police had killed his grandfather, and his grandfather was an older gentleman, so the cops run over his grandfather. He thought, wow. So he has gone to the police station armed with a shovel, and he has smacked the sergeant in the leg with the shovel, incapacitated him at the front of the police station, and was going to kill the sergeant. He was stopped, and he was stopped by police and standers by, and his grandfather, who walked out of the police station.
Oh, my goodness.
And what had happened was that his grandfather used to go around to the cop shop for a cup of tea occasionally with one of the police officers.
As you do.
And he was standing somewhere in the carport with his feet sticking out into the carport, but they couldn't see him because he was behind a wall. And the cops ran over his toes.
Oh, my goodness.
In the carport. And his nephew thought that they'd killed him and he'd come for vengeance.
Wow. Did he get charged?
Yeah, he got charged, and we explained it, and the court accepted what he'd done. I think he got a custodial sentence that was suspended because you can't go hitting police officers while they're on duty.
No.
So it was quite serious. But, misunderstandings, people not getting the right information.
Yes.
So we're talking about youth. This crime of pinching vehicles, very, very prevalent in a lot of communities around Australia, and it's usually committed in company.
Yes.
And it'll be a home invasion, and they'll source the car keys and the wallet, because we're creatures of habit. We generally, if I walked into your house, you'd probably put your keys in your wallet in a similar place to what I do.
Yeah.
It'll be in a basket on the coffee table or on the hall stand.
But a key hook. Could I make it any more obvious?
That's right. Yeah. Here is the stuff.
Yes.
And it's very subsistence offending. So the pattern that I saw a lot of was go into the house, keys and wallet, leave the house, pinch some stuff on the way. Food is often a big one. And then proceed to the service station to get smokes and a bit of fuel, just under $100. Then to Macca's to get food for the clan. Then to the grog shop to get just under $100 worth of alcohol. And then you drive around, you get the whole family together and share everything, and then you pass on the keys and the card to the next bloke. It's usually the third one along the line that gets busted.
Yeah.
And then you go through the CCTV. And it's all very subsistent stuff. But during the course of them running around in the bloody car, quite often unlicensed, they're damaging property and then damaging people sometimes.
Yes.
And usually it's themselves. It's usually themselves running into a post and then the people in that car getting damaged. It's
or, then they burn the car, which has
burning
its own
the car.
other.
Yep. That is all too common too.
Become a lot more brazen, I think. So the substantive charge is unlawful use, but it's started with entering a home, and the courts are really harsh on burglary or home invasions.
Yeah.
As they should be.
Absolutely,
Your home
I
is the
agree.
place you should be safe. But
absolutely,
back when I was practicing, we had a lot of unlawful use as well in Beenleigh. And I remember one guy who had dropped out of school, and he literally spent his days, he'd start at the Helensvale train station, he'd go around the car park, pick a car, break in, drive it to the Robina station, dump it there, pick a different car, drive around in that. He had literally over 100 charges just doing the same thing, which is similar mentality, but without that risk attached to entering someone's home.
Yeah.
There was no harm to the owners because it was all separate from the home and the person. And so it is a real concern. And in Rockhampton, they've got a huge problem with that type of offending at the moment. But community groups are forming, and, I don't know for sure, but like Facebook pages, we've seen kids in this street be alert on this street, or this car got taken. And so the idea of vigilanteism, because they don't think the police are cracking down effectively enough.
There was that mob up there, wasn't there?
That's right. And it's, but they are so brazen that you can understand the thinking, we have to do something. But that's not the answer either. It's
these young people, these young offenders are usually from a pretty underprivileged background.
Often, yeah.
So if we were to have a look at some statistics, and I think you did provide some statistics here. But if we were to look at statistics of the perpetrators of these sort of offending, the percentage of the offenders that were from a socially and economically disconnected background, I think would be huge.
And look, youth offending is its whole other issue generally. But the other thing is that there are overall less young offenders now than there were 10 years ago. But you've probably heard, that the issue is these serious repeat offenders who are persistently committing crimes, even after they've had interactions with the justice system. And their offending does tend to escalate. They get more brazen, they get more violent on occasion, So youth generally, I think, are portrayed as our biggest issue at the moment. And definitely something needs to be done about youth offending, but it's been sensationalised to such a degree when really there has been work done in this sphere and there are positive inroads being made, but there are the group who give all youth a bad name,
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of really positive things with young people these days. I've got young boys myself, late teens, early 20s, and I've had the opportunity to go out with them to some music concerts, and I used to do that a lot when I was a teenager. And the venues that they've taken me to, the behaviour has been much, much better than what I witnessed when I was a young guy going to live music venues. The rules have tightened up a bit to what they were when I was going and seeing live bands. I can remember one particular scene where you're allowed to bring alcohol. So and back in the early 80s, I was only 16. There were people bringing crates of long neck beers, like 750ml bottles of beer, to a pretty wild rock and roll concert. And at the end of the night, it ends up with bottles being pelted at police officers and riot squads outside, and just absolutely crazy scenes. But what I've seen here at the Gold Coast, a couple of venues that I've been to, young people dressed really nicely, being very considerate of one another, considerate of other people's property. It's really impressive, very, very impressive. So there seems to be an element, and I think it's very closely linked with their economic and social environment.
Yeah, I think that is often a factor. Not always. I think we can't pigeonhole it to that. But I think if we were looking at statistics, it would be definitely a factor in many of those.
Thank you very much for listening to another episode of Crime Scene Gold Coast with Guardian Criminal Law. We're enjoying bringing you these podcasts on a weekly basis, and we look forward to bringing you many more. We've got a Patreon page where you can subscribe. That'll assist us in bringing you future episodes, and also any money raised through that goes towards a youth help program that we're running. We look forward to your company for many months to come. Thank you.